Everyone. Morning in US time at least. Welcome to all of you and to those that are not in the US, in Africa and elsewhere. Welcome to this webinar on the state of peace in South Sudan and the implementation of the 2018 peace agreement for that country. I am Laurie Nathan. I am director of the Kroc mediation program. The Kroc Institute is located in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and our seminar today is being hosted by the Washington, D.C. office of the Keough School. We are delighted to have IGAD and swisspeace as our convening partners. IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, is the regional multilateral forum for peace, security, and development in the Horn of Africa. It has been the lead mediator for the South Sudan civil war that broke out in late 2013, as well as the mediator for other conflicts in the region. Swisspeace is a renowned NGO that supports peacemaking by the Swiss government and undertakes high-quality research and training on mediation and related activities. Today's webinar builds on the Kroc Institute's previous activities relating to South Sudan and to IGAD's peacemaking mandate. These activities include research on the implementation of the 2018 peace agreement, training leaders of the South Sudan Council of Churches in mediation skills, participating in the drafting of the IGAD protocol on mediation and preventive diplomacy, and contributing to the IGAD review of its mediation for South Sudan in the period 2013 to 2015. At our seminar today, we're going to discuss this review, which identifies lessons and recommendations that are intended to strengthen future peacemaking by IGAD. Our main focus, though, will be on the revitalized peace agreement that was signed by the conflict parties in 2018. To what extent has this agreement been implemented? What are the obstacles to full implementation? And what is the current state of peace and stability in South Sudan? Addressing these questions, we have an outstanding lineup of speakers. In the order in which they'll speak, they are firstly, Ahmed Hirsi, who is Senior Advisor to the IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan, and he will present the mediator's perspective on progress and challenges in the peace process. Then we will move to Dr. David Lance, who is co-head of the swisspeace mediation program, and he will discuss lessons from the 2013 to 2015 IGAD mediation. We then have Emily Keough, a youth representative of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission for the Peace Agreement, and she'll present a civil society perspective on implementation of the peace agreement. We'll move then to Professor Madhav Joshi, who is Associate Director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute, and he will present insights from monitoring implementation of the peace agreement. And then finally, we are honored to have Ambassador Hannah Teta, a special representative of the UN Secretary General to the African Union and head of the UN Office to the African Union. Ambassador Teta was also one of the co-facilitators of the 2018 peace agreement for South Sudan. And she will present main challenges and recommendations going forward. Ambassador Teta is currently in Accra, Ghana, I think stuck in traffic, which is why we are not going to see her live, but she will be with us, but with only her picture, her fixed picture available to us. We will have time for audience questions and answers before we close. We have already received a very long list of fascinating questions, and unfortunately, we will probably not have time to get through all of them. In any event, I move now to invite Ahmed to present our first input. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you very much, Dr. Nathan. I thank also the Institute for providing us this opportunity to speak on a topic that we have been very much heavily involved and heavily invested. It was not actually have been very proper the ambassador himself to be around, but because of exigencies of work, he has been called urgently to come to Juba to witness another landmark agreement of warring parties with the Khartoum government being signed maybe 2 days from now in Juba, which we take note of. Those meetings were convened in Juba, so I think the agreement is within parties that are fighting Khartoum government, and it's hosted incidentally by Juba itself. So that has been a success. I will go to my topic of presentation, on the mediators' perspective on progress and challenge in the peace process. I'll slightly give a bit of a background of which we all know, and then the progress made so far with respect to the agreement that had been signed in September 2018, which is called the Agreement for the Resolution of Conflict in South Sudan, and then present the challenge. I think it will be of the view that what I say is also already a widely held information or knowledge within the academia or many other researchers or even diplomats, people like Ambassador Teto, who has also facilitated some of the work that I'm going to talk about. On the background, South Sudan, I think, fought, we all know, a bitter protracted war for independence. Only 2 years after gaining its independence, it had to fight itself in a bloody civil war, pitting the brothers in arms in the liberation struggles to fight bitterly. The outbreak of violence started in December 2013, was the outcome, the way we believe it, of tensions within the ruling Sudanese People's Liberation Army or movement, which has come to the fore, whereby President Kiir dissolved his cabinet in July 2013, dismissing a number of senior officials, which included Vice President Riek Machar and the Secretary General Pagan. This followed challenges also to his leadership during a political bureau meeting of the SPLM in March 2013, whereby Machar and Pagan, the Secretary General, declared that they're going to unseat democratically the President Salva Kiir. Tensions intensified in November, and December, it triggered a shootout among the presidential guard, which spread into a violence flowing into the city and the outskirts. Now, the government of the Republic of South Sudan arrested a number of politicians tied to these two senior officials, Machar and Pagan, and Machar has to slip out of Juba, go to Jonglei State, where he organized an armed resistance to the SPLA, and he declared the SPLM-IO in position, as we officially right now refer to him. And it's at that juncture now whereby IGAD Council of Ministers in an emergency meeting sent the AU Commissioner for Peace, a United Nations Special Envoy, and a senior official from IGAD. And in December 26, the Ethiopian Prime Minister then, Desalegn, and the Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta convened an urgent meeting of head of governments in IGAD region in Nairobi for the resolution of the conflict. So this mandated IGAD from that day on to be heavily involved and invested in the IGAD, in the South Sudan process. 3 special envoys were actually appointed: Ambassador Mesfin of Ethiopia, General Lazaro Semboyo of Kenya, Mohammed El Dab of Sudan. The mediation culminated in an agreement of August 2015, some of I think you know about it, which lasted until July 2016. That's just only 1 month short of its existence, 1 year. So fresh fighting broke up in 2015, which led us to serious hostilities. And it is at that juncture that the IGAD's involvement brought in a process called a high revitalized forum, whereby when Ismail, the ambassador, was appointed, that has to be created, which led to the present process of the revitalized agreement. In the agreement, this was very comprehensive, and this led to have at least roughly 9 chapters. It was much more comprehensive, much more wider than the 2015 agreement. And I could safely say that some of the lessons that IGAD has run was that after this envoy is finished, the work and the reconciliation process of the 2015 agreement, they have handed over the work to them, people who were there thinking that peace will prevail, and everybody was retired out of the process. So I think this is a lesson that we have learned from the cessation of hostilities agreement of 2015. This time we are sticking with this agreement of September 2018, which has made an encouraging progress so far. The ceasefire, basically as we speak now, is the backbone of the agreement, and we are in the longest truce since 2013 in terms of security. There's no active hostilities going on. There are quite a number of pre-transitional period institutions and mechanisms that are in place. The RJMEC, of course, the other institutions that have been created by the agreement, which are seriously very much involved in and are present in Juba very heavily. Another major progress is the formation of the government itself in February 2020, which is now in the state of at least 36-month transitional period to oversee all that has been mentioned by the agreement to be completed. And we are now 8 months into those 36 months. We got 28 more months to go. I can safely say that there's a number of achievements there are two issues that are stumbling block. One was the transition security arrangement, which is actually going very slow. And the other one was the number of states, which we encourage the parties to agree to. So I think the two major concessions were traded off, with Dr. Machar relinquishing on his demand that he's not going to join a government of national unity unless the transitional security arrangement is completed, which could not be completed under those circumstances and based on the realities of the ground. And Dr. Salva Kiir to relinquish on the 32 or 38 states that he has created through a presidential decree. So both agreed that each one should stand down from that and culminated in the formation of the February 20, the current agreement whereby Mr. Machar is part of it. There are quite a number of tasks which are remaining to be completed. One is we already have a vice president as Machar and 4 others, 35 ministers, 10 deputy ministers who have been sworn in March. There's also local governments. I mean, there's a sharing of responsibility within the government or the governors and local government, with the exception of we have a state called Upper Nile where there's a bit of contention, whereby Machar appointed a general of which Salva Kiir doesn't want. So that's a bit of but the rest has been done. There's also other tasks that remain to be done, is to reconstitute, dissolve the current parliament, which doesn't have a mandate, which is the Transitional National Legislature, and appoint through a consensus new members to the new parliament. The constitutional amendment bill that incorporates the provision of the agreement, current agreement of 2018, is incorporated into the 2011 constitution, and this is a plus. It's right now in the Council of Ministers. Has been debated, and it's assumed, it's believed that the Council of Ministers will pass it, and which commits now the agreement, which entrenches the agreement in the constitution. Political negotiations among parties have been increasingly becoming more inclusive and collegial, and there's a lot of consultation, and at least we're proud to mention. I will go to the challenges that surround the agreement as we move around. There's a general sense of pervading, lack of political will by all the parties to implement the agreement in the letter and spirit. And this actually stalls the implementation process and takes it into the time of the pre-transitional, the transitional period of 36 months. There are also competing interests that leads to some of the parties to understand or interpret the agreement in a different ways. And IGAD has to be called upon to mediate in those two, in order to bring people to the table. But there are these interests that are emanating from the parties in the interpretation of the law. we have there's a trust deficit, we can say, among the parties themselves, and this is a result of many years of fighting. And this is where again IGAD is trying to propose a series of leadership, which all the parties in the Article, series of leadership retreats. And I think that program was sort of delayed or pushed back by the advent of COVID in March, but we have those line up to at least deal with the issue of trust. Funding is another challenge, and a recurring challenge. Peace is a very expensive undertaking. There's always a shortage of fund, and basically also there's an overall donor fatigue in terms of South Sudan, because the country has been going on through a conflict process since 2013 to date. So there's a pervading sort of a donor fatigue when it comes to South Sudan programming. They also, even within a party or sort of an alliance like SSO, Sudan Salvation Opposition Alliance, there are many alliances which actually keeps shifting. There are also schism or problems within them when it comes to taking up positions that are offered by the current government. So there's always a split. We come in, IGAD comes in to at least to seal that crack, but it hasn't become a major crack yet, but that's also within the parties that have signed to the agreement as one entity also seem to either mutate or split off due to the internal politics now in terms of jockeying for position, who will take which position in government. That has been. The other serious problem is the high-level defections, and it has a security implication. Just 2 days ago, there was a defection of a General Moses, declaring him to join himself with the South Sudan Defense Force, which is the Kir part of it, and this immediately causes hostilities from the people from the other side. He has left IO, basically. So defections at the security level, at the armed personnel level, and defections in terms of politicians in Juba is also really killing the spirit of the agreement as we speak, because one side is depleting the other one. With regard to security, we also have a number of parties that are actually actively armed and still involved in hostilities. We know this non-signatories, General Thomas Cirillo and Paul Malong. Those non-signatories don't want to come on board. They don't agree with this agreement, and they want the agreement to be opened up. And they're putting a pressure on the agreement and the parties in the agreement to open up. So there are hostilities, active hostilities going on between them, and occasional clashes. Although there have been a move by the community of St. Keough, a Vatican-based group that brought in South Sudan Opposition Movement Alliance together with Article parties to sign an agreement in February for cessation of hostilities. They seem to affirm to the agreement called the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement of 2017, and that, which has been sort of somehow superseded by the current agreement. Nevertheless, there will be a meeting in Rome, and they have one thing they have pledged in this Rome resolution. They have agreed in February Rome resolution to cease all hostilities. They have agreed to be part of a transitional security arrangements to join up with other creation of a national unified forces, and we have instructed Citizen, an agreement institution which looks at the security arrangements, to absorb or register and enroll personnel who are coming from that armed grouping. Right now, I think there's a commitment from Italy, the UK, and Switzerland, I would say, to put some funds for the activity, for the absorption of that force to be part of the national force and partake what has been cited in the agreement as the transitional security arrangements. So I think that's one plus for them. And we get Council of Ministers are also trying to move and push so that the number of I mean, to finish all the pending tasks in the transitional task as stipulated by the agreement. Overall, I think there are a few other things. There's basically one observation is that the agreement and basically the parties and the personnel around the South Sudan government is a bit elitist, and there's a little public participation or public knowledge. We've made attempts so that I think the agreement is popularized through Radio Sudan, South Sudan, but there's a little public participation. That's one thing. There are, as we have said, security threats from the non-signatories are never present danger. There's an inter-communal clashes in South Sudan. People are very much heavily armed society, both in the rural area. And it's tribals who hold arms who are, there's a thin line define what is an armed group and what is a tribe. So they're all armed and sometimes can all be a grouping. So that's also the issues of arms, the issues of gun culture, and the issues of lack of ungoverned space is also one particular problem. I've mentioned about the defections in terms of armed personnel. I would like to mention that currently countries are undergoing a problem, the humanitarian situation. There's a lot of floods since last year and the beginning of this year. Locust has been another problem, causing a problem to farmers. And we also have the new thing called COVID. One of the challenges also, there's a lot of international actors very much involved in the peacemaking in South Sudan, multiple actors. So sometimes they come with a different perspective and various interests. I think with that, I think I will leave it for some of the colleagues to mention a bit. Thank you very much, Chair.
Ahmed, thank you. That was a fantastic synopsis of the current situation, both the progress and the challenges. You know, we focus at events like this and more broadly in the peace world, we tend to focus on the peacemakers, the mediators, their partners, the donors, etc. But I would simply emphasize your point about the political will of the parties. At the end of the day, whether there is peace or not, whether the peace agreement is implemented or not, depends not on the third parties, it depends on the conflict parties. And their political will is ultimately the most important factor of all. So thank you for that. I hand over to David Lance.
Thank you, Laurie. So in my intervention, I will focus on the initial period of the peace process. So from December 2013, when violence broke out in Juba, to August 2015, when the initial peace agreement was signed. And I believe this initial period is important to understand the current peace process. And it's also the period which is covered by the review of lessons learned, which you, Laurie, have mentioned in the introduction. And it is that review, that study of lessons learned, which I would like to focus on in my presentation. And allow me to share my screen for that purpose. There we go. So about the study, it was initiated by the IGAD Secretariat, its Mediation Support Unit, with support from the Swiss Foreign Ministry. The aim of the study was quite straightforward. It was to examine the IGAD-led mediation in South Sudan and draw lessons from it in the hope of informing future mediation engagements of IGAD or of other mediation entities. My team at swisspeace, together with Laurie Nathan from the Kroc Institute, were put in charge of conducting the research underpinning the lessons learned. We did so by conducting interviews with various people involved in the process, mediators, their advisors, negotiators, also experts and diplomats who were involved in the process. We analyzed internal documents which IGAD put at our disposal, as well as published material. And we also drew on a background study completed by the Sud Institute, I think tank in Juba. This all resulted in a draft report, which was subsequently discussed, adapted, and validated by IGAD officials. The final report, you see it here on the screen, was published this year in June. It contains 44 lessons across 11 themes. You see the themes listed here on the slide. I obviously won't be able to cover everything, so I invite you to read the report. As a teaser, I will elaborate now on 3 particular lessons which arise from IGAD's mediation effort in South Sudan from 2013 to 2015. The first lesson I want to focus on pertains to the response to violent conflict in South Sudan. IGAD was very quick to react when violence broke out in Juba on 15th of December 2013. Within only 4 days, IGAD dispatched a high-level ministerial delegation. Within 2 weeks, IGAD heads of states held an extraordinary summit, mandated the mediation process, and appointed special envoys of high stature to lead it. And within 3 weeks of violence erupting, the IGAD-led peace talks started. And that speed, the speed of IGAD's reaction, is quite significant, and it probably helped to contain some of the escalating violence, even if, as we all know, it didn't stop the violence per se. However, many experts that we spoke to, including from within IGAD, said that the writing was on the wall before December 2013, that the power struggles between SPLM leaders, which bubbled up after President Keough dissolved his cabinet in July, were likely to lead to violence. And even so, there wasn't a sufficiently robust diplomatic push to prevent that scenario, neither from IGAD nor from other entities. And the lesson, therefore, is that while early action and political leadership in the face of violence is important, diplomacy and dialogue should be used before violence escalates in a preventative logic. That's the first lesson. The second lesson I want to focus on pertains to the lead mediators. As you know, the IGAD heads of states in December 2013 appointed 3 envoys. Dr. Hersey before mentioned their names. These envoys were political heavyweights with intimate knowledge of South Sudan and also with personal relationships with the parties. And this proved to be quite useful. In addition, having 3 envoys from frontline countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Sudan, helped to anchor the process in the region. It provided leverage and it secured buy-in from the region. However, there were downsides. Having 3 envoys posed different coordination problems. It also imported into the mediation team some of the political divisions in the region vis-à-vis South Sudan. It made it more difficult for the mediation to have a unified, cohesive approach. And the lesson arising from this is that appointing a single envoy might be the better approach. Alternatively, when multiple envoys are appointed, a clear lead should be designated and a division of labor spelled out in the mandate. Third and final lesson concerning the role of external actors. The peace talks in 2013 to 2015 were driven by external actors putting pressure on the parties. This kind of leverage has proved necessary in the peace process in South Sudan, and indeed the peace agreement in August 2015 was reached because there was strong pressure from the region and also from the United States, which made it clear that if there weren't an agreement, it would impose sanctions against senior leaders and push through an arms embargo. This kind of pressure secured the conclusion of the agreement, but there was a price to pay. The leverage meant that the parties signed the agreement, not because they were convinced that a settlement was in their interest, but because they caved to external pressure. And this was especially true for Salva Kiir and his government. Indeed, the government in Juba perceived the agreement as being imposed, and in a sense it was. The text of the agreement was primarily drafted by the mediation team, and the process was quite rushed, especially in the final weeks. This meant that the parties had limited ownership and few incentives to implement the agreement. Not surprisingly, when international attention shifted elsewhere and pressure dissipated, the parties reneged on some of their commitments, and this eventually led to the collapse of the 2015 agreement, as you all know quite well. And so the lesson that derives from this is that while external engagement is necessary, it must not be the only engine of process. For mediation to succeed, the ownership of the parties, the relationship between them, in particular its leaders, and the genuine consent of the parties are necessary or even indispensable. So just in conclusion, let me just again say that what I spoke about now focuses on the period from 2013 to 2015. Perhaps in the discussion we have time to explore to what extent IGAD has incorporated some of these lessons into its current efforts. And at the very end, let me just say that from a mediation perspective, these kinds of transparent lessons learned generating exercising, basically using the past to inform the future, are quite valuable, and I for one hope that other mediation organizations would follow IGAD's example. With this, thank you for your attention, and back to you, Laurie.
David, thank you very much for that. Your last point about ownership is obviously critical. It ties with Ahmed's point about the political will of the parties and the need for reconciliation between the parties, because at the end of the day, their cooperation is required for the implementation of the agreement and for peace, stability, and sound governance. Ahmed also raised difficulties in relation to the elite nature of the process and the absence of adequate involvement by civil society. This has been a contentious issue throughout the process, despite the insistence by the IGAD summit that civil society be included in the peace process. It's therefore fitting that we turn now to Emily, a civil society representative in the Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, to give her perspectives. Emily, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laurie. It's a privilege to be part of this conversation with distinguished panelists, as you mentioned them in the lineup. I want to start by saying that this perspective that I'm sharing in this platform is not the official position of the civil society fraternity. It's a perspective based on my individual observations as a member of the civil society. We have not yet sat as civil society to come up with an official assessment, the latest official assessment of where things stand. But this is where things stand as I see them. Are we locked in crisis? I mean, are we locked in a lack of progress? I would say we are locked in a stagnated. It's not even progress. We've stagnated at this time. The reasons are there. Some have been mentioned by the preceding speakers. But who is responsible? It's mostly the parties, the South Sudanese parties, but also I must say IGAD as a mediator is responsible here. And I'll go on to say that although we started off at the end of 2018 after signing the peace agreement with very good momentum, commendable at the time, the then chairperson of the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission set us at a pace, and he made an outline of 12 key things that had to be implemented immediately just to set us on a good pace. And that included parties, stakeholders, and everybody else nominating representatives to mechanisms of the peace agreement, commitments to uphold the ceasefire, and a number of many other things, as many of us might be aware of. But over time, we've seen progress slow down, become sluggish, and that has warranted 2 extensions of the pre-transition period, as we saw, and then a late formation of the RT-GONU, or the Transitional Government of National Unity, in its revitalized form, which is also partially formed. At the national level, we only have the executive formed, that is the presidency and the Council of Ministers. And then at the state level, we have a partially formed executive too. And with only 9 governors appointed out of 10, no ministers appointed. There is a vacuum at that level with all the prevailing issues at the state level. And we've seen also a number of bad signs, like the tendency for one particular party to make appointments without the consultation of others. That is post formation of RT-GONU. We've also seen alteration of things that have been agreed on. For example, the National Constitution Amendment, the Constitution Amendment Bill has been amended by one party without, yet they had sat already in the NCSC, that is the National Constitution Amendment Committee, to agree on the position which had to be final, and all what was required was for the Parliament to then incorporate that into the Transitional Constitution of the Republic of South Sudan. And in addition to that, the President has been required by IGAD, by stakeholders, and by even the RJMEC Secretariat to dissolve Parliament according to procedure. The Parliament that is said to be existent is an illegitimate assembly, at least according to some of us, most of us in the civil society. And the failure to dissolve that, and despite a number of calls from IGAD has repeatedly said dissolve Parliament, and then the President or the Presidency is not able to yield to that call. That is problematic. It shows that the mediator is not being listened to. And on judicial reforms, we are talking transitional justice. On that front, we've only had conversations that have started with the AU. We also have conversations that have started on Chapter 6, just about organizing the workshop by RJMEC for the stakeholders. Just bits and bits of certain aspects of the chapter. And on the security front, yes, largely we have a ceasefire that is holding. If I am to compare the period of the agreement, the first agreement of 2015 to the current one, we have a largely holding ceasefire. Yes, there are holdout groups that have not been able to be part of the implementation, but the combat and the engagement in conflict has been restricted to just certain places, although there is intercommunal violence in other places that remains to be addressed. And then also the good thing is that, as Ahmed mentioned, that there has been the Rome process that is making attempts to bring them on board. Where that can go, we are yet to see. And parties are still also adamant, and especially the party that is seen to be the heavyweight, that is the former incumbent TGONU, is not able to have its forces. I say its forces because until today we do not have a national unified army constituted by all the integrated forces, and we are lagging behind on that. So until today they've not been able to vacate at least 18 civilian facilities. That is dangerous when it comes to building confidence of civilians who want to see those places vacated, so that then they can return from the internally displaced camps and the refugee camps, and the rest of us to have to feel a sense of respite at the end of the day. And then the military defections, of course, that have been mentioned, and just yesterday there was a RJMEC plenary and that was condemned, but we have seen that over time, the tendency to continue recruiting from each other and destabilizing each other when it comes to the military power that each has to wield. Although when it comes to to when they have to agree on their power sharing ratios. I have observed the tendency to exercise a spirit of collegiality. That is often when we see it, although still we see inconclusive agreement on, for example, the allocation of state portfolios until to date. That is very dangerous because you still have a vacuum at that level at the state. You have two other arms of government that are not formed. The National Assembly is not formed, and somehow they have agreed to go ahead and first focus on formation of state governments before formation of the Transitional National Legislative Assembly, which in itself is a violation of the agreement. If they have agreed to amend in the spirit of collegiality, we expected to see that amendment to be in tandem with the provisions of the agreement. That is according to Article 8.4, which requires that any amendment must be done by certain entities, and that includes RJMEC. We've also seen the humanitarian situation get worse, of course, exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic and the floods over time. And COVID has been used as an excuse. The second quarter of this year and now this third quarter of 2020, we have seen very little progress seen with mechanisms unable to convene their board meetings. And it's only yesterday from March that RJMEC was able to have a plenary. And that is a very important mechanism for decision making and advising on how we can progress. And so, but why are we here? It's a number of reasons that have been given, and I'll just add to what Ahmed and David have mentioned. The parties have failed to afford the process the seriousness it deserves, and they're still struggling to overcome the tendency to look for excuses. And that is something that we have seen not just in these two peace agreements, but even past in the CPA pre-independence. Of course, number two, there are funding constraints. That is not just with the parties not being able to commit resources. I can't expect all parties, but the ones that have been in charge of our resources throughout the conflict, that is the incumbent IGAD, has not been able to provide the adequate resources until to date. And then civil society is also having constraints in terms of funding, attributable to the donor fatigability that has been mentioned by Ahmed. And we still can't, previously the previous agreement collapsed and warranted revitalization because of lack of unreserved good faith on the part of parties. We continue to see that when coalitions are having internal problems and then they accuse another party of having infiltrated them to disorganize them. When we see the defections, the military defections, that is a lack of good faith on the part of those parties. And misplaced priorities that are not inspiring the commitment of partners. Partners from the beginning say that there must be commitment from the parties, and that is the condition they are giving for them to offer support. That has not been forthcoming from our observation. And then, but why did I say IGAD from the beginning? Until to date, IGAD has not been able, the heads of state and with the Council of Ministers, those bodies have not been able to appoint a substantive chairperson of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission. And we saw a change of guard in terms of the interim chairperson, called interim, but supposed to be the deputy chairperson. We were the drafters of the initial agreement, we are very deliberate in thinking that there has to be a particular individual who fits that status to be a chairperson of RJMEC, because there's something it does to the agreement. And until today, it's not done. But what does that then mean? It's a stark reminder to parties that the mediator is also failing and does not have the adequate moral capital to be calling out parties when they are failing to implement their part. And then finally, the pandemic is here. It has been used as an excuse. It's people failing to be versatile and not adapting to to mechanisms like what we are using right now to convene meetings, to have dialogue, to take the conversation forward. Although I must say there's an exception. The National Constitution Amendment Committee has adapted and has been able to continue with its work by also convening conversations among within its membership using some platforms, virtual platforms, and that is commendable. We cannot afford to continue using this pandemic as an excuse for not moving forward. The pandemic is here. It will go. There will be another pandemic, and life has to go on. People must be versatile, and we should be seen to be making progress. I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Laurie. Thank you very much.
Emily, thank you. Asante sana. There's been a common theme from our speakers so far with respect to implementation, and they are all, David Lance, Ahmed, and now Emily, underlining that we should not view the political process as peace negotiations, and thereafter the implementation process as a purely technical exercise. The implementation process is political and reflects the power struggles of the parties, and may be afflicted not only by technical difficulties, but by a host of political difficulties. So with that, it's a great way of introducing my colleague, Madhav Joshi, who will talk about implementation. Madhav, in the Peace Accords Matrix at Kroc, are amongst the international experts on peace accord implementation. Madhav, over to you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you very much. We at the Peace Accords Matrix program, as Laurie was saying, independently monitor the ongoing peace implementation process in South Sudan. We do this because we have a strong empirical evidence that shows that independent information can be useful in building trust, can be useful in mobilizing resources, and advance the overall implementation going forward. We also have empirical evidence showing that the peace accord that is implemented at a higher rate stands higher chance of reducing fragility and also making substantial socioeconomic and political progress in the post-conflict years. In today's presentation, I plan to touch on 3 quick points. One is obviously going to focus on the current state of RCES implementation. We all have been doing this from the very beginning of this panel, but I'll do that one more time. The second point, I will deal with the possible causes behind the slow implementation in South Sudan. We obviously have alluded to this in multiple ways, the previous colleagues here. And third, the significance of continued mediation in sustaining the peace implementation process in South Sudan. I have a few slides to share to demonstrate how the progress is going on in South Sudan. Can you see here? Very good. So here, this is not the new information. I have 2 sets of information. This one, the information mostly comes from most recent RJMEC reports. And we talked about the pre-transition period that was extended a couple of times. Within pre-transition, there are 69 specific tags that was laid out, and all parties agreed to those tags. Within 69 tags, there are 7 specific tags that relates to the training and deployment of the necessary unified forces, and those tags, have not been done. It is a pre-transition period, tags that are still not completed, and we are already in the transition period here. We already have into the 8 months of the transition period. Coming to the transition period here, we have 186 specific tags within the transition period. This transition period is for the next 36 months. And we are already, we only have 28 months left. By looking what's going on from the reports produced by RJMEC, there are only 2 specific tags that were completed. and it relates to the formation of the national unity government, and then the, to some extent, appointment of the governors in the state, at the state level. There were 69 specific tasks that were supposed to be initiated or implemented by last June, and they already missed the deadline. Now you can think of 186 tasks to be achieved in the next 28 months, which is a huge task. So then how it compares to the other peace processes going forward. So here, in this slide, you can see based on PAM methodology, we were able to track, okay, what is going on in South Sudan compared to other peace processes. So this is, the first graph, it tells you the 100% of implementation, and then, it for the different categories. In peace accords matrix, we track 34 comprehensive peace accords, and we have 51 different provisions. And within those 51s, the South Sudan has 26 specific provisions that were to be implemented in this peace process. Out of those, only 3 have, based on our methodology, of course, we have a different methodology than the methodology that RJMEC is using. Here, only 3 provisions have a full implementation record, and 3 provisions are in the intermediate implementation status. 9 provisions, they have a very minimum implementation that Emily was talking about, not significant progress. They started, but not significant progress. And 11 specific provisions, like the one, constitution writing, the reintegration of combatants, the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the economic reform, judiciary reform, and you can name it. They have not started anything on those provisions here. Then, the overall and the second graph, you can see the overall implementation progress. The black vertical line gives you the overall progress of RCES, where it stands as of now. It's about 30% implementation. From 1 to 100, it's about 30% implementation. Compared to other peace processes, at the end of 2 years mark, it is about 48, 49%. But within 34 comprehensive peace agreement cases, we were able to find 4 cases with a similar implementation success at the mark of 2 years. And these 4 cases are Rwanda, Lebanon, Angola's 94 agreement, and Senegal's agreement. So, and then, this graph also gives you the 10-year trajectory going forward, how it looks like. You can see that 2 cases, Lebanon and Rwanda, made some progress here, but other 2 cases, not so much. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the pathways to successful implementation process for this particular peace accord is narrowing. You have a 50-50 chance to be a successful peace process here at this stage because of the progress that they have made so far. Now I come to the second point here, then what could be the possible causes for slow implementation here? I'm from a peace process background. I do a lot of study on the factors that contribute to successful implementation and things like that. So my field of study, my research and field of study suggests 2 possible explanations for this one. One is obviously the commitment problem, the lack of political will that we already talked about. When the parties negotiate these accords, all accords, they oftentimes negotiate under tremendous international pressure and under tremendous pressure of ongoing violence. And once the peace agreement is in place, they have incentive to renounce the commitment after that. The second reason is, we alluded to this to some extent, relates to technical and resource capacity here. Signatories, they do not know what they are negotiating when they are negotiating the peace accord. And they are not also very realistic in terms of whether the reforms that they are negotiating can actually be implemented under a certain deadline. In case of South Sudan, it's really interesting. I think it's a unique case. It has both problems. It has commitment problems. It has resource problems. It has, technical capacity problems to implement what is being negotiated and put in the revitalized peace agreement. And we also talk about the COVID crisis that is obviously causing some harm here in terms of the work of the monitoring of ceasefire violations and things like that. But as it was said, it should not be the cover-up for the lack of political will of the parties here. There are reports coming from South Sudan that there are no regular cabinet meetings. And also, we all know that the South Sudan is financially broke at this stage. It does not have any foreign reserve. The financial capacity is not there. So now I move to my third point that I'm trying to make here is the need for continued mediation support. South Sudan, I think, is the perfect example. There is a lack of political will among political actors, and then lack of resources and capacity here. So it is a perfect example where mediators need to remain engaged with the process to save the process. It's a hard-fought peace agreement, and there is no alternative to implementing the peace agreement. So oftentimes what we assume, as a practitioner, as a researcher, is that the role of the mediators ends once the peace agreement is in place. But actually that's not the case. There is more for the mediators during the implementation process. And I list them here, a few that I identified, and we can pick up during our conversation. The first one is the implementation is simply the another bargaining. When you implement something, you identify the winners and the losers, and there is always bargaining among the parties. And it becomes delicate, especially during the implementation process, because the process is now open and you are including more stakeholders at the national level and at the sub-national level. So the bargaining is even more complex during the implementation process. And there is a huge role for the mediators to play. The second possible reason is the timeline. As I was saying, in any peace process, it's not only the problem in South Sudan, they have never met the timeline. It is very frustrating, as a researcher and as a practitioner, but obviously it is also related to the capacity and then the resource they have. And then the third point that I would like to make here is the signatories, they have a very different readings of the peace accord. Sometimes ambiguities are good during the negotiation process, but when it comes to implementation, the same ambiguity can cause implementation impasse. And that's why, if we have the institutional knowledge of the mediators coming from the negotiation process during the implementation process, that will tremendously help the parties to overcome that ambiguity during the implementation process. And then the third point, the next point that I would like to make here is about the sequencing preferences. We see this in full place in South Sudan. From the very beginning, the incumbent government wanting to go for the unity government without implementing the necessary unified forces and then the state boundaries. So they have a very different implementation sequencing preference than the other signatories. Then how you reconcile those preferences? There is a huge role for the mediators. As was said, South Sudan, everything is transitional in South Sudan. They have the transitional constitution, and they have to write the final constitution. Constitution writing process itself can be very contentious. In Nepal, it took 10 years. And we have a deadline of next 28 months in South Sudan. And after that, there will be a post-conflict election that will then institutionalize all the reforms, right? The election can be really contentious, especially given what's going on in South Sudan. So there is a risk of violence before election. There is a risk of violence after election. So there is a lot that for the mediators, and I'm not saying that. Obviously, it's a very difficult process, but it is not that we cannot contribute to the success of this process. This is a very timely debate, and I look forward for picking up some of the things during the conversation here. Thanks, Laurie. Back to you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for a sophisticated perspective on the problems associated with implementations, both in general and in the South Sudan case. Madhav has emphasized the role of the mediator during implementation. So it's Fitting that we are able to hand over now to SRSG. I've had the opportunity to observe Hannah as a mediator, albeit in a simulation exercise, and she was a tremendously successful mediator, very empathetic, solid, firm, who was able to guide the parties in this difficult simulation to a relatively successful conclusion. As I explained earlier, Hannah has internet connection difficulties in Accra, so we're not, we're going to be able to listen to her, but not see her perform visually. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you very much to all the other panelists for their valuable contributions, which I think have summarized the situation that currently pertains in South Sudan very well, and also goes into the reasons why we have some of these challenges. And so I'd like to give a perspective on perhaps re-emphasizing some of the points that have been made already on what is left to be done, but also the areas where I think that if there were a bit more attention, perhaps we could move this process along faster. Now, I think there's a general consensus that the progress on the implementation of the transition agreement is too slow. And if things continue at this rate, the transition actions will not be completed by the end of the transition period. And that in and of itself then becomes a factor that risks further instability at some point. My colleague, David Shearer, who is the SRSG and head of UNMISS, emphasized this point recently in a press conference where he also noted that the transition and the implementation of the transition is moving at a pace which, because there doesn't seem to be the same kind of momentum and impetus towards getting things done, the slowness of movement in and of itself can be a risk to the process. During the mediation process, now wearing my previous hat, one of the biggest disagreements we had was on the security sector reform, because there was a vast difference of opinion between what SPLM in government in Tigonu, SPLM-IO, and the other opposition elements thought should be the main features of the security sector reform. And as mentioned previously by one of the participants, they wanted to have a unified forces without necessarily going through that process of integration. But we've seen in previous peace processes in Mozambique, in Angola, as was mentioned by your colleague, that the security sector reform is an integral part of ensuring that you don't slip back into conflict. And therefore, the pace at which it has been undertaken and the lack of resources and the lack of commitment towards that process, again, is one of those risk factors that can impact overall the implementation of the agreement. So I think that it is worth continuing to emphasize to all the parties that, yes, a transitional government has been formed. Yes, you have a president, you have several vice presidents, you have cabinet positions, you've now been able to agree on the states, but a government was formed to govern. And in this case, to implement a transitional agreement over a fixed period of time. And so now that those things have been done, the focus has to be on implementation. And while there are other appointments that are still pending, things can be done simultaneously. They don't need to be done one after the other. To that end, the reconstitution of the transitional legislature is also an important critical function because it was envisaged by the revitalized RSS that there would be some legislation that is key to the transition process. Delaying the discussion or delaying the formation of the transitional legislature holds that back. But I think that from the contributions that have been made by other panelists on this platform, I think there's one thing that strikes out. Stands out for me, and I think should strike to others as well, is that you have a situation where the transition in South Sudan has been largely an elite process, and an elite that does not trust each other. And so therefore, the creation of or having those trust exercises, as previously mentioned by Ahmed, or finding the space to build the trust between the parties in government is key towards the implementation of the transition. But I think that another way that we can also promote, if you like, greater trust, not just by the parties in government, but ultimately between the parties in government and the people in South Sudan who they are supposed to be governing for, is to have a much more transparent and accountable government. And therefore, the emphasis has to be on greater transparency in public financial management. When you know what revenues are coming in, and you know how those revenues are being allocated, and there is a shortfall, I think that there will be a greater level of goodwill among possible donor partners to support the ongoing security sector reform and transitional process, knowing very well that it was not just a question of the country was having financial difficulties because of the fall in oil prices and the fact that they don't have a diversity of financial resources, but there would also be the feeling that the money would be properly used for the purpose for which it was intended. Now, building a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society with a strong sense of national identity is a challenge that is faced by almost every country on the African continent. So that's the reason why transparent, professional, and effective state institutions, where you do not necessarily, where appointments are based on merit, where you focus on building a meritocracy, where you create the confidence that allows the general public to believe that government is taking place in their interests, is critical. I think that the issues of public sector financial management in South Sudan and addressing those challenges is going to be key towards implementing the RSIS and moving from a transitional government to a substantive government. For as long as there is some amount of lack of clarity as to exactly what is happening in that space and exactly how public sector resources are utilized and deployed, I think that is going to create the excuse that the resources are simply not there to allow the transition processes to be properly undertaken. Now, for the parties that have committed to the cessation of hostilities agreement we negotiated in 2017, but not to the agreement itself, one can understand why that happened, because they simply did not agree with the way in which the revitalized RSIS agreement was finalized. It goes back to the issue, among other things, about security sector reform. But it also goes back to the structure of governance and the way in which the transitional agreement was finalized. And that's why I'm saying that emphasizing the need for effective public sector institutions, for more transparent public finances, for financial accountability, for greater inclusivity in the process of governance, not just among the parties who have negotiated the agreement and who are in government, but including civil society. There was a reason why we said, and we emphasized, even in the revitalized agreement, that there should be greater participation of civil society, women, and the youth. Because the point was made to all the parties a number of times that at the end of the day, those who have the privilege of leadership lead people. They are expected to work on their behalf, and those people also have to have the opportunity to make their inputs. Now, we've created a structure called RJMEC, which was supposed to monitor the implementation of the agreement. So that creates the platform that enables both civil society and the parties to the conflict and other South Sudanese to be able to discuss how they are going to build their future. The outstanding tasks that need to be done, the establishment of the mechanism for the truth and reconciliation process, the completion of the national dialogue, none of these things are going to be able to take place in a way that inspires confidence if there isn't an extra push on building a more effective and professional public sector, however basic the infrastructure of that public sector is. And I think that if there was a substantive JMEC chair who had the political stature to be able to move this process along and continue to engage with the parties to move forward, requirements and the things that were agreed to in the revitalized ARCIS agreement, I think we could make greater progress towards creating a platform for a new government with a mandate as a result of an election to be able to administer a state where at least a level of confidence has been restored in the public as to the effectiveness of their government, and we could move forward from there. But I think that unless we're able to deal with the issues of public sector finances, greater transparency and accountability, completion of the security sector reform, the establishment of a new transitional legislature, and working towards ensuring inclusivity is not just something that is used as a popular phrase, but is actually implemented is actually at the core of whatever is done in ensuring that this agreement is implemented as was envisaged during the discussions. I think that unfortunately we might find ourselves in a couple of years' time saying that, well, we've been lucky, maybe we've continued to have some degree of peace and not an outbreak of large-scale conflict, but we're still not quite near to being able to move from a transitional government to a substantive government. And I think it would be very unfortunate if that is where we were. And those are my remarks, Laurie.
Hannah, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to listen to the clarity and wisdom, the insights when you do these presentations. So Hannah's raising the problem of lack of progress with respect to SSR, security sector reform, which typically in these kind of situations poses a paradox or a conundrum. On the one hand, it's essential to have SSR in order to achieve peace and stability. But on the other hand, if some or all of the parties are not yet committed to peace and stability, they need their forces, they need their combatants, and they need their armaments, either to make further gains or as an insurance policy for fear that their enemy or opponents might move against them. So this is a really thorny problem that has to be addressed. I must say that we've been inundated with really fascinating, interesting questions. We're not going to be able to get through all of them. I'm going to kick off the questions by turning first to Ahmed and then to Emily, and I'm going to combine two questions that are not necessarily linked logically, but I'm going to give both of you the same two questions in the interest of time. So the one question is, what steps are being taken to ensure greater participation of women? I mean, we've spoken generally about civil society, but in particular, what efforts are being made to ensure greater involvement of women in the peace process? And the second question has to do with the effects of COVID-19 on peace building and peacemaking. Emily did touch on that briefly in her presentation, saying that it shouldn't be used as an excuse for lack of progress, but it'll be interesting to hear further thoughts on the effects of COVID-19. So Ahmed, if I can hand over to you, and then we'll move to Emily. Ahmed, you are still muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I'll try to answer the two questions. As far as implementation is concerned on, the role of women, the agreement calls for 30 to 35%, first of all, quota in terms of both government and in terms of we have been following very much this issue with the current Artigono. We called upon them in the Council of the IGAD Council of Ministers. It was carried in our communique that these things has to be done. So we continue pushing for and advocating for the role of women. And as per the agreement, it is, as far as I know, it is 30%, and we want to reach that one within this transitional period. Has been called upon by the Council of Ministers as well. And we have a full-fledged resource person based in Juba right now courtesy of UNIFEM, who is supporting IGAD in that process in terms of supporting the technical support. We have been serious dialogue, national dialogue with the government of Sudan in terms of promoting or creating a national action plan for creating a space for women to take part in implementation, and of course the leadership and the political space for women in South Sudan. COVID, I think COVID, what I agree with Emily or whatever has been mentioned, it has disoriented us. We have a full staff in Egypt, in Juba, and as well as Addis. And if you look at the corporate now, most people are not in their duty stations, they're working from home. Although for us, I think we're still around. Actually, it has hampered our way of really doing work, because our staff presence, we're using a rotation system. Those who are already interacting with the government, after some period, they are sort of rotated and others move in. But it has seriously affected, as mentioned by Emily, it has really affected the way we're doing business. But I think COVID will be with us, and it's time that I think we understand and move as we used to move before. That's just what I can say regarding those two questions.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ahmed. Emily, your responses.
Yes, thank you very much to whoever asked those questions. When we look at of course, what is stipulated in the peace agreement is that 35% affirmative action. Well, the article says executive, but at the NCSC level, there was sort of there was an amendment when the constitution amendment bill was being prepared by the NCSC, and parties agreed that then it would be upheld at all levels of government. That had been missed in capturing it in the text of the agreement. So what happened? So what has happened so far in the constitution of the revitalized transitional government of national unity, with only one arm of government formed at national level, we've only seen 26% out of the 35% required of parties in the major ministerial positions, and 10% for the deputy ministers. That's the match that has been seen. That means that parties have failed collectively. They have failed to uphold this principle of affirmative action, 35%. What is being done is to constantly remind parties that this is very important. It's something they agreed to, and it's a violation of the peace agreement when they fail to do so. Now, it depends on who wants to do what and how they can do it. For civil society, we can obviously engage differently. One of the things that the women's groups, specifically the Women's Coalition for Peace, has done is to develop a matrix that captures the number of women that must be appointed at different levels of government, and disseminated that and shared that with the different parties and relevant stakeholders, so that we are able to follow up and watch this together, but also have a number of meetings with them and tell them that this is something that they have to do. It's absurd that we have to do this, but that's the context. Again, there are structural issues in society that make it very difficult for parties to adhere to this, yet they signed up for it. But we've also seen IGAD, like Ahmad said, constantly reminding the parties. But beyond that, what one would have hoped that we should be seeing punitive measures for this kind of behavior when parties fail to adhere to this principle. And now on to COVID. COVID, we have seen it divert the attention of parties. Immediately, the first vice president, on being appointed, was then made to lead the COVID-19 task force. And it took some bit of noise from the rest of us, including from the medical fraternity that I am a member of, saying that no, you can't politicize COVID-19. Please return to what you're supposed to do. This has come along, but it can be addressed by individuals who have the expertise to address this pandemic. And for a while, we saw that the the main opposition party had its attention diverted to the handling of COVID-19. And again, pandemics come with resources. In a context where we have issues of accountability, resources, when people see money coming to a pandemic, then that is the place where everybody wants to gather. But then we also saw it being used as a reason to escape responsibility for failure. You know, whenever there have been meetings held to speak to parties and ask them why things are not moving, there's always somebody who will pop up the excuse that COVID-19 is an excuse. And that's why myself and I want to believe Ahmad have purpose to say it here, that COVID-19 should not be used as an excuse. And then we've also seen COVID slow down the convenings of mechanisms of the peace agreement. And that means it's very hard to monitor ceasefire, to move and know how many numbers of forces still remaining in the cantonment sites, owing to the fact that many have had to leave because there are logistical challenges. They do not have food, they do not have water, so some have had to desert the cantonment sites. So from time to time, it's very hard to keep record of who is in the cantonment sites. That's owed to COVID-19. RJMEC only managed to hold a meeting, a plenary yesterday, since COVID-19 came into play, and that is already a challenge. It makes monitoring of progress difficult, but also intervening in a timely manner also challenging. Thank you.
Emily, thank you for that. I want to direct the next question to Hannah. Emily made the point about impunity or lack of accountability with violations of the peace agreement. And Hannah, you in your remarks, you'd underlined the importance of government that is not only transparent, but accountable. So this is a difficult, sensitive political question, always in peace processes. To what extent should those who violate a peace agreement be punished in some fashion? Or would that risk jeopardizing the stability of the peace process and render it even more unstable and uncertain? So this is an invitation for you to talk on the question of impunity and accountability for violations of the peace agreement. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. I mean, I have no illusions about the fact that these are not easy things to do, but that does not change the fact that they need to be done. Otherwise, on what basis do you even talk about signing an agreement if there isn't some pressure that is brought to bear on the parties to implement what they have agreed to? Now, when it comes to issues like quotas on the number of women who ought to be part of the government, as Emily was referring to, those are things that I think that between the civil society, the international community, the international community, and by that I mean IGAD, the African Union, the United Nations, all of whom are supporting the peace process in South Sudan, we also have to take it upon ourselves to remind the parties of their commitments and to strongly suggest that given the fact that this is something that you said you were going to do, it can also be one of the issues that we take to measure your performance and implementation. And at the end of the day, it can also be used to determine how well or how much support should be given to other activities that would require this kind of inclusivity. I think that the important thing is that we have to be, for those who are committed to supporting this process, we have to be creative about it. Now, I know that my colleague David, at any point in time, and whenever he has the chance to do so, it states the issues quite bluntly in terms of what has not been done, what needs to be done, who takes responsibility for it, and what we expect to see. So that while we as the United Nations do what we can to support the implementation, we also continue to emphasize that this, at the end of the day, is something that has to be done by the South Sudanese transitional government. What I think we need to work towards is to quickly move towards creating those structures, strengthening existing structures that can help to create a better opportunity for accountability. For instance, I have another colleague who is SRSG Premila Patton, who is the Special Representative for Sexual Violence in Conflict. and she's been watching the South Sudan situation for quite a bit. And she made direct interventions with the parties to the RCES to get them to commit, and not just to commit, but also to implement those commitments to make sure that there is accountability for sexual violence in conflict. Otherwise, it will never stop. And she's also made it very clear that these are benchmarks that she is reviewing, that she is monitoring, and that she reports on. And what we can do within the United Nations, of course, is to report to member states, to report to the Security Council, so that based on their assessment of the situation, they can determine what kind of sanctions there should be for different levels of non-compliance. But that is almost like, you know, continuously having to hold a hammer to the head of the parties. I'm not sure that that is always helpful. I think what we should be doing more is to create those conversations between the parties that make them realize that this is something that they need to take responsibility for. And when they do, it will be acknowledged and it will be appreciated, as opposed to continuously banging them on the head with sanctions or something else.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, you're raising a tough question that my students have to grapple with in class, which is, you know, where leverage is required to ensure that parties honor their commitments, what is the right balance between sticks and carrots, the distinction between sanctions of some kind and inducements and incentives for good behavior. I want to turn finally to Ahmed. I want to invite Ahmed to give his views from the mediator and IGAD perspective on accountability and impunity, and also ask you, Ahmed, how recent developments in neighboring Sudan have affected the peace process in South Sudan. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you. I think the issues of accountability and impunity was explicitly, explained by Dr. Hannah, and at some points along in the implementation process of the agreement, we used to have a tight deadline when the mandate or sort of the government that, well, a party of the government that is in Juba was expiring, and we wanted to have a government of national unity. So we had a few days to grapple with. And at a time that instead of having a political vacuum, I think some sort of a government should have been to implement the process of as stipulated in the agreement of access. So there was sort of in the back of the head of some the leadership in the region discuss the issues of punitive actions for those who are going to be wayward and not to implement that. So it's also a bit hard to get a consensus from the regional leaders in IGAD to have a unified, so rather than have a cessation of hostilities, have an agreement implemented. We were yet to get around the idea of at least having punitive actions in place in a unified position. That's why we normally use a dual track sort of. We have to approach some leaders, say that, can you bring pressure on Salva Kiir, or can you bring pressure on? And I think that's been the normal, our culture of doing things. So it's a bit difficult to answer, but I think the issue of accountability will need to, impunity needs to be addressed at a multilateral level, not at the regional level, but at the international level. Should be able to be escalated at the UN Security Council level, as spoken by Hannah. And then that's also subject to countries or some member states within the United Nations or not agreeing to what is being proposed. So it's a process that is that can be sabotaged or sort of undermined. And I think that should be borne in mind. The other question on the neighboring of Sudan, yes, it has an impact and a greater one, because parties, including the SPLM North and other parties in fighting Darfur, we're getting the support from Salva Kiir. As much General Bashir, and with his legacy, he was also supporting Riek Machar and perhaps people who are actually fighting the Juba government. So with Bashir out of the way, and the process for peace have been started, and I think 2 days from now, I think there will with that agreement, it seems that will be a prevailing sort of dialogue that, okay, we are tired of war both in the north and in the east, and no need to undermine the other one. It's time to work together. And I know for at least the Prime Minister Hamdok, from what he has discussed with the other leaders, want to bring Sudan out of its isolation, with its current status, so that sanctions are out. So I think this also will aid the peace process, and the comprehensive agreement that has been signed between the north and the south, maybe actually the groups that are fighting the north, will help sort of take the Sudan or Khartoum government on the road to recovery. I think it's very significant, basically, that this agreement will have an impact on both sides. Thank you.
Ahmed, thank you. Colleagues, I'm going to bring our seminar to a close now. I don't want to exceed our deadline of 1 o'clock local time. My apologies to those of you in the audience that posed questions that haven't been answered. One of the questions related to whether the panelists' presentations could be made available. So let me just say in that regard that this entire event is being recorded. It went live on YouTube, and in due course, a recording will be available on the website of the Keough School. I want to thank members of the audience for their active engagement through the Q&A function. I want to thank all our panelists for fantastic contributions in capturing the complexities of peacemaking and peace building in South Sudan. I want to thank also all my colleagues at the Keough School for all the logistical organizing and creative work in helping to put this event together. Those of you in the audience that wish to stay in touch with us, you're welcome to do that. Our contact details are all available on our website, and contact details indeed for the panelists will be available. So with that, I thank you all very much for your participation in this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you when we do this again in the future. I'm bringing this to a close now. Thank you very much.